For the borrower, I would say, number one, do your budget. If you're trying to do a owner-occupied purchase, you're going to be the owner and you're going to occupy it. Make sure you have your budget in place and you're ready to be well documented.
Hello, and welcome to Real Loan Talk, the podcast where we unlock the secrets of creative financing and real estate. Hosted by Sonya Morgan from S.J. Morgan Private Lending Exchange, this show is your go-to source for expert advice on mortgages and real estate investments. Whether you're buying your first home, managing your investment portfolio, or considering a reverse mortgage, Sonya's insight will guide you through the process. Get ready to learn, grow, and achieve your financial goals. Let's dive into today's episode.
Wow, welcome today to Real Loan Talk with Sonya Morgan, where we are going to speak with investors and with experts in the field of creative financing, and also those who have borrowed money utilizing creative financing, just to help everybody learn a little bit more about how creative financing works. And today we are honored to have Mr. Jim Graham for our actual very first podcast episode. Jim is not only an investor, but he also is, he helps run a real estate company that specializes in investors and manages investment portfolios and has a lot of years of experience in the financial world as a CFO. And so we're super honored to have you today. Thanks for joining us today, Jim.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And so I actually would like to start each of my episodes with a dad joke. I love dad jokes. So that's going to be one of my requirements of my podcast guest, is that you bring with you a dad joke. So I think you were prepared today with the dad joke. So let's hear it.
Okay. Well, I actually went and looked up a couple of them. So do you know how to make water?
How to make water?
Holy water.
Oh, holy water. No idea.
You boil the hell out of it.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Jim. Totally appreciate that. So it's great to have you today. And I just kind of want to start with also, before we get into the private money and creative financing questions, I would also like to ask you about the first time you purchased a home. So I know that you're a homeowner, but I think it's really important for a lot of our viewers to know what it feels like for people when they're buying their first home. So do you remember what it was like when you bought your first home?
Well, gosh, we're talking back in the 1970s. So it changed. It's certainly changed a lot since then. Actually, my first home purchase was a private purchase. Didn't even use real estate agents, and literally called up a bank and arranged for a mortgage on the phone. Very simple, very straightforward. Very little documentation back in those days. So I don't remember it as a painful experience at all, or an intimidating experience like it can be today. Like the keyhole that we kind of have to put everyone through in buying a home today. My experience was very simple and straightforward.
Do you remember what the terms were of the first loan that you had, like what the interest rate was, or was it a 30-year fixed?
Well, it was a 30-year fixed. I think it was probably about a 6% interest rate, even back in those days. I had a very small down payment. Of course, the homes were very inexpensive compared to today back then. So nothing turned out intimidating. Literally, the first house my wife and I bought after we got married was in Columbus, Ohio. And I was very, very focused on the monthly payment. And I can remember actually working with the bank to try to get it down another $25.
Okay. Did it feel like a lot to you at that time? Like, oh, this is a big thing I'm taking on.
Lot. Yeah, and literally this was back in 1975, and my house payment ended up being $350 a month, if you would believe that.
Wow.
And so it's one of those situations that you can't even relate to today. And I bought it was a brand new constructed 3-bedroom, 2-bath, about a 1,500 square foot house with a 2-car garage. Um,
Wow.
and I
That was
bought it for
luxury
less
back
than
then. That was a big
$100,000.
house back then.
Yeah, bought it for less than $100,000. So
Wow.
uh,
Wow.
it's one of those that you hear us gray-haired folks talk about that you can't even
Right.
find.
Yeah. But it's still, even for you, it was scary at that time, right? Like you felt like you were
Oh
taking on
yeah,
a lot.
oh yeah. My wife wasn't working. We just had our first child. I was basically I had graduated from college in 1967, went into the Army, came back out. So we're talking 1970s. So I'd only been in the workforce for about 5 years. So
Mhm.
just making get by wages. So
Mhm.
it was intimidating back then.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how long did it take for you to feel like comfortable with the payment? Like after you actually started making the payment, how long before you're like, oh, this is good. Like I got this.
Oh, just a couple months. Once you kind of let it settle into your budget, you
Mhm.
learn how to manage through it. And it became very simple and straightforward, um, and didn't have any angst or anxiety about losing the house or having to give it up or anything like that. Once we got into it and got into
Mhm.
and it worked into our budget.
It's interesting that you say that too, because I do hear that a lot from people that are like buying their first home. They have this fear that they're not going to be able to make the payment. And then what happens? And they're going to lose the house and they're somehow going to be a failure. I feel like a lot of people have that same emotion, like this is too big of a payment. Like what happens when, something goes wrong, and you know what I mean? And so, but like you said, once you get in and start making payments and you're kind of like, oh yeah, we can handle this. We got this.
Well, you think about it, the anxiety comes from if the downside happens. It's very upsetting to your life. It could be upsetting to you financially for years if you had to literally give the house up to foreclosure because
Mhm.
you're out of the house market then for a long time to get that
Mhm.
foreclosure off your record.
Yeah, yeah. So, did you have to make a lot of adjustments to your budget then to actually make that happen, or?
No, it's I'd come out of a rental that I was paying about 275 a month for. So
Mhm.
talking about a $75 a month increase, I was
Mhm.
making less than $1,000 a month back then.
Yeah.
So
So that was
it
a
was
significant increase.
it was a significant increase. So
Yeah. Mhm.
um, it gave me some pause for cause, and I just kind of settled into it. And
Mhm.
we literally had to sit down and focus very hard on the budget, on what we were going to
Mhm.
do and how we were going to live our life. But we were
Mhm.
loving the house. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
those,
It was worth
it
it.
felt like you'd made it.
Yeah.
It's one of
Yeah.
those ta-da
That's a good
moments.
way to describe it. That's a good way to describe it.
One of those things that everybody, when I was growing up, everybody aspired to be a homeowner.
Mhm.
That was one of those things that was a part of the American dream,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
finally made that big step.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it still is, part of the American dream, you
Yep,
know.
yep.
They say that it's fading, but I believe it's still part of the American dream. So, is there any advice that you would give someone who was thinking about buying their first home?
Well, you stop and look at your job security. Number one, are you in a good position? Will you have continuing income out of wherever you're gaining it, self-employed or being employed? And number two, get a realistic budget in front, something that you can live with in terms of how much of your income can you dedicate to housing. Because when you buy a house, you're looking at a number of things, not only the payment, which is the principal and interest, you're looking at the other costs that come with it, property
Mhm.
taxes, insurance, and just the upkeep of that house.
Mhm.
So make sure that you have a realistic budget or have worked with someone that can get you a realistic budget put in place so you know that impact on your how much you're going to have to dedicate of your income to that.
Mhm. That's really good advice. And there actually are people out there that you can go talk to that will help you work through your budget. That specifically, like we have people that we can send our clients to that just to make sure that they are preparing themselves, to, buy that home and be able to afford it. So that's really great advice.
And I haven't done this recently, but you can just jump on Google and probably find a housing budget form that you can fill out just to help yourself through that process.
Yeah, that's good. It's really wise advice, especially from somebody like yourself who is very financially minded. So that's like getting that balance. If you spoke to somebody else who was more like made emotional decisions, they probably would have a different form of advice. But that's really great advice from somebody, especially who has a financial, practical mindset.
And the one thing you should do once you get that budget in place is adhere to it very strongly, because there's nothing worse than being what I'm going to call house poor. And every dollar that you bring in goes to maintaining that house or keeping that house. And you've got nothing in terms of discretionary money. And that can be very stressful on you.
Yeah, that's true. It's true, for sure. Well, thank you very much. That's great advice. I'm sure that it will help a lot of people. And the next thing that I really like to talk about today, because I know that you're also an expert in this area, is creative financing. And so specifically, the creative financing piece I want to talk about today is private money lending. So you have lent, your own money or your own funds, but you've also helped facilitate the lending of, other investors that you are close with and that you help manage. And so I just wanted to ask you a few questions today about the things that if somebody were coming to borrow private money, maybe the things they don't understand. So just kind of getting inside the mind of a private investor. So we're talking about a private investor lending money on a real estate transaction for somebody to buy real estate property. So can you tell us, I know that there's several different ways that money can be lent. But let's start with for you, if you're looking at lending somebody money, what are a few of the most important traits that you're looking for in a borrower?
Well, when I look at a opportunity to invest, one of the first things I look at is the borrower, and there's really there's two, maybe three simple things that I'm looking at that will get them through I'm willing to work with this person. Number one is, do they have a good credit background? And when I say good credit background, that helps me understand, are they a manager of their money? Do they meet their obligations? If we've got a history of missed payments, skipped payments, that type of thing that has knocked down their credit score, well, that makes it more difficult for me to take them on as someone that I would want to lend to, simply because if they run into a tight spot, am I going to be that person if they skip or miss a payment with? So that's probably the first thing I look at in the borrower. The next thing I'm going to look at is, it's one of those things that you have to look at. It's not fun to look at. Is their criminal background history? I don't want to lend to someone that is been dealing in areas that are not legitimate. The third thing I'm looking at is, in that borrower, what is their plan to pay off that loan? Because when we're dealing in hard money today, we're not talking about, in most cases, we're not talking about a 30-year loan. We're talking about somewhere between normally a 3-year and a 6-year loan. And I want to know what their plan is to pay that loan off. And if it's a credit issue, how they're going to cure that credit issue. If it's an income issue, how they're going to, what's their potential for fixing the income issue. It's that sort of thing that I'm looking at.
Those are really good answers. So, and you brought up looking at the credit report. Are there any items that specifically stand out to you or raise a red flag on credit other than, a few lates here and there?
Well, I guess it's overuse of credit that I don't want to see somebody with 24 credit cards and 4 car payments. I want to see somebody that is prudent in using credit, because credit can help you and it can also hurt you. So I'm looking at someone that doesn't have a tendency to over leverage themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I know when I'm looking at credit, before I present it to you and other investors, I'm also looking at the bankruptcy history. So you want to tell us a little bit about why bankruptcy history is so important to an investor?
Well, bankruptcy history says that the borrower really, if they've got a bankruptcy in their credit history, says the borrower overextended themselves for some reason and ran into a situation where they couldn't meet their obligations. Because a mortgage is a contract, and if a mortgage is defaulted upon, they've just failed to meet the terms of the contract. So I want to understand thoroughly why that bankruptcy happened. Is it something that was within their control, or something that was goodness sakes, a medical catastrophe happened and it knocked them back on their heels, and bankruptcy was their only solution? If it's something like that, it's more understandable than just overextending yourself, trying to get all of the material things that you want in your life.
Yeah, it's funny to me. Sometimes I will have people call me, and they don't end up coming over to you, but they'll call me and they'll tell me they're looking for private money, and that they have a mortgage already. They're trying to get some relief from, but they say they had to file bankruptcy, so that they could save their house, from whoever was lending to them at the moment. And they're asking me for private money. And I think to myself, like, you just told me that you didn't want to pay the person that lent you the money on your house, but you want me to find somebody to lend you money in your house again, so it's like, and they don't understand how that's kind of an oxymoron, but it's just interesting to me that people, they don't see bankruptcy the same way that an investor sees it. From their side, they think it's protecting them, it's saving them. From an investor side, it shows something about, how the borrower, in the situation when they've just overextended themselves, how they protect themselves, so it's a protection for the borrower, not the investor. And it's a protection that they've used. And so that will raise a red flag for me when I'm looking at it.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. And so also when we're doing private money, it's never really a super long-term loan, right? Though it's usually the idea is that it's like 1 year to 5 years at a max. So what are some of the benefits to an investor on having these like shorter term loans?
Well, the investor typically, I'm going to use myself as an investor. I typically don't like to have a long-term loan beyond 5 years, simply because I like to have some level of liquidity in front of me. Because if you commit to a loan that, let's say it's hard money loans or private money loans, typically carry an interest rate probably on the low side of 8%. Don't see many of those, maybe 9% on the low side, high side at 12%. But if you're locked into a loan that is 7-8%, and you see these 9, 10, and 12% loans passing you by simply because you're locked into it, that's the downside of a long-term loan. You're losing opportunity. A short-term loan gives you, it's a positive in my view, because it gives you an opportunity to relook at what's out there and an opportunity to reinvest it.
Yes. I do notice that with a lot of oftentimes investors like one or the other. They either like the short-term ones because oftentimes they're the flips and they're higher interest rates, and there's that feeling of like, I'm in it, I'm out of it. I'm in it, like whatever the risk they were taking, it was like fun. It's almost like, it's not gambling, but it had that feeling of like, I'm investing in something. Ooh, and it came back to me. You know what I mean? And so when you get into something that's longer term, oftentimes, like you said, the interest rate's a little bit lower. It's just kind of a longer drawn out process. And so you're always going to have that feeling like, is this going to end up well? Is it, you know what I mean? So it puts you in it for a longer time.
The benefit of a longer loan is typically there's less risk involved, because it's going to pay a lower interest rate, and it pays a lower interest rate for a positive reason. That positive reason is that there's been some risk removed out of it. There's a higher loan to value. It's a borrower that has a good plan in place as to how he's going to use the money and how he's going to finally pay off the loan. It says those sorts of things that generally will help to build a longer term on a loan.
Correct. And you use the term higher loan to value. And so just to like break that down into like layman terms, what you're talking about is that the property is worth a lot more than the loan that they have on the property. So there's a lot of protective equity. And a lot of times people will call me. I just had a call this morning when they were like, tell me about private money and, how do you use and lend private money? And they think in their mind that it's for people with bad credit or, down on their luck. And it's like, that's not what it's for. It's for people that have unusual or creative circumstances, but have a lot of equity in the property and are still good borrowers, that you would personally lend your money to, you know what I mean? But they're just in a situation where they're not bankable at the moment. Right. So what types of transactions or borrowers are typically like a no-go for you and your investors?
A no-go for me and my investors is you look at the securing property is generally what will cause it to be a no-go. Once you get past looking at the borrower itself, and that no-go falls into a couple of arenas. Bare land. The reason I say that's a no-go is that you're looking at what if this loan goes bad and I have to take it back and I end up owning the property? What's my ability to recover and sell that property? Bare land is tougher to sell than a piece of real estate with a house on it.
Or income producing, right?
Correct. The other no-go is the condition of the property. If it is very well maintained, that's a positive. If it's junky, if it's worn out, if it's not maintained, if it needs a lot of work, that will tend to be a no-go for me also. So we look at it's bare land and the condition of the property are the two things.
That's really interesting that you utilize condition of property, because a lot of private money loans are about the condition of the property, because they're used as flippers, or there's somebody that's buying the home and they'll fix it up for a couple of months and then refinance into a loan that, will allow it. But I have also seen, on that note, I've also seen a lot of investors that are location specific, right? Like they don't want to lend in certain cities, or they don't want to lend in certain areas, or they don't want super remote property. Like location seems to be a really big thing for investors as well.
Well, you mentioned location. We deal with a group of investors that we tend to play in our own backyard. We like the Central Valley. We know the marketplace from, say, a little bit north of Stockton to down to Merced. We may go as far south as Fresno. And so we kind of know that marketplace. We understand it. And so if it's San Francisco, we tend not to want to go over there because we don't know that marketplace, and we don't know the properties, and we don't know the neighborhoods, and that sort of thing. The same thing with Sacramento. If you get that far away from us, it's knowledge of your marketplace, I guess, is the other part of it that will tend to be that one other no-go if it's outside of our area of expertise.
Yeah, you make a really good point, because that is really the truth about private investors. When you see like hard money, and it's a fund, they don't usually have these types of parameters that a private investor will have. Private investors, they want to understand their market. And that's why local private money is always a better, more flexible option for buyers than just like a fund out of New York, because, your local investors understand the market. Oftentimes you can get through a transaction without an appraisal because they can drive over to it. They understand what things are selling for. It adds a different level of a different way to underwrite it and a different level of understanding and funding, right?
Well, you just made a good point. A couple of my investors that I bring to the table, they live here in Modesto, and they will literally go and drive by the property as a part of their decision-making process. They want to look at it.
Yes.
They want to understand it, get a feel for it, get a look at the neighborhood it's in.
Yes. And so that's why a lot of times I say location, location, location. Like if I have a flipper, somebody that's purchasing a rundown house and it's a really nice location, that's going to be easy to fund. If they're trying to overdo a house that's in a neighborhood that's run down, then that's going to be a little harder to fund, or maybe even impossible. So, yeah.
Correct.
So, and I know that you're familiar with a lot of different types of accounts that fund private money. So I just wanted to kind of hit on those like quickly, because when money, I've talked before about like a fund, like where there's multiple investors in a fund, and that's not really what you deal with. That's not what I deal with. We deal with like individual investors. but they don't always just fund out of their bank account. Sometimes they fund from different, accounts. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what a self-directed IRA is? I know that you utilize it personally. Some of your investors utilize, self-directed IRA, and how do you fund real estate out of that?
Well, I have moved my IRA over to a IRA custodian that will deal with what they call non-traditional investments. A non-traditional investment really is something that is not on a stock market. It's not on the New York Exchange or NASDAQ, or where it's not a stock or a bond. They'll allow you to take and direct your funds as an investment towards real estate or real estate backed notes. So that is what I'm going to call a self-directed IRA that you would want to get into if you've got substantial enough funds that you want to take advantage of the interest rates that private money gives you. And it takes, I look at that as it takes some of the risk of loss of principal away that you can control, that you can't control. If you're investing in the stock market, if there's a world situation that happens, the stock market can go down, you lose a lot of principal. That's not true if you're investing, taking your IRA money and investing it in a real estate backed mortgage note. You're typically not going to lose principal if it's properly vetted. So, and the IRA custodian will work with you in establishing the vetting process that you need to have in place before they will allow you to invest your money and maintain it as a deferred income that your IRA requires.
Yeah. So, for example, you utilize funds from your retirement account that's in an IRA. You fund a loan, and then the payments on those loans, they go directly back to your IRA. Like, you don't see the payments; they just
Correct.
help your investment grow.
Yeah,
Tax free.
If you have an IRA, it will require a servicing company to handle that note for you, and that servicer is then required to make the monthly interest payments directly back to the IRA. They cannot be sent back to you as the account owner of that IRA. You can't touch the funds because once you take custody of the funds, it's treated as a distribution, and which becomes a taxable event.
Yeah. So I feel like we could probably have an entire podcast just on investing in IRAs, and maybe I'll ask you back in the future just to have a conversation about that, because I think that's a big conversation that a lot of people should hear about. But you also help your investors utilize trusts, like family trust, to invest. And so, like, how does that work?
Well, it's almost like investing directly from your personal savings account, although the funds happen to be held in a legal trust. And the technicality that you have to make sure is in place is that you have to make sure that the note and deed of trust is excuse me, correctly correctly written to be entitled correctly, that it's payable to the trust and not to an individual.
Yeah. So if you're working, so at Ashay Morgan, we get a copy of the trust and we look at the trust and we make sure that we're titling it correctly. So if you're possibly, funding with a different company, you want to make sure that they're doing that. You want to make sure you're seeing how the note and the deed are being written up to be in the trust, because when the loan gets paid off, that check is going to be made directly to whoever's on the note, and you want that to be the trust. So the money's going back into the trust, correct?
In a part of the vetting process in looking at the trust has to have the correct language that will allow you to make that type of investment also. Okay. And that the person doing it is authorized by the trust to do it. So there's just several. You have to understand the language of the trust, but once you get those two or three pieces in place, it's just like investing out of your own private savings at that point.
So and how is using an IRA or a trust different from investing with a corporation? Somebody has an LLC or a corporation and they're investing. Is that any different?
Not really. Other than, again, it's how the note and the deed of trust is entitled, because again, it'll be made payable to the corporation or the LLC versus being paid to an individual. Beyond that, again, most of the private money loans will be interest only with monthly payments. So again, a servicing company will have to handle that note rather than you personally being the investor, and they will make the payments to the entitled corporation that's on the note versus being payable to Joe Blow who happens to own stock in that corporation.
Got it. Yeah. So I think that's the key thing. Like you were saying, when you look at a trust, you're trying to determine from the trust who the trust allows to manage the money, who can sign for the trust. It's a similar thing with a corporation. You want to make sure whoever you're doing that business with, that they're allowed to, put that corporation into that kind of contract.
Mm-hmm. And typically, it's not unusual for you to ask for, as being the agency that puts the loan out there, to ask for a corporate resolution saying that the corporation's authorized to do this.
Yeah, and we do it specifically because we don't want a problem at the end. Like we could just put willy-nilly thing on there, but when the loan goes to be paid off, if we haven't done it correctly the way that client wants it to be done, then the funds aren't going to come back the right way. They're not going to be made out to the right person. The right people aren't going to be able to sign the check, the transfer. It makes a mess at the end. It's not a mess for us in the beginning. It's a mess that we probably wouldn't deal with unless the investor came back to us and said, you made a mess. So yes, it makes sense for us to see that. We always ask for the corporation paperwork, send it to title even for them to look at, to make sure that when it gets reconveyed, that we've done it correctly to start with.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so then any difference in just funding from your own personal bank account? Like how is that any different from the other three?
Well, it'd be, rather than coming out of my Pensco, I'm using Pensco, my IRA, I simply write the check as Jim Graham. I'm writing the check to fund the account, and all of the interest payments come directly back to me on a monthly basis. I do have the opportunity. I wouldn't recommend it, but I do have the opportunity. I could self-service a loan if I'm investing in it directly from myself. Whereas everything else we've talked about typically should go through a servicing company that can manage it for you.
Correct. And even if you're an individual and you were to fund a transaction that wasn't owner occupied or had some type of escrow account, then that also would need to go through a servicer, just to make sure that's clear too.
Correct.
So yeah. And so I feel like a lot of this information we've talked about today is helpful for both somebody who wants to borrow private money or somebody who might want to lend private money. So would you have any just kind of final advice before we wrap up for either of those individuals? Advice maybe for somebody who wants to utilize private money to purchase real estate, or maybe somebody who's thinking about investing in real estate backed notes?
Well, let's start with the investor. Typically, a minimum size loan is going to be about $50,000. We're not going to be in the business of trying to invest monies less than that. We can go as big as you want to go, but I would try to not put too many dollars in a single bucket, if you will.
It seems like a first investment for investors. Usually they want something that's $150,000 or less. For put their toes in the water. They don't usually want to go higher than about 150.
Yeah, and they want just to see how it works.
Mm-hmm.
For the borrower, I would say, number one, do your budget. If you're trying to do a owner-occupied purchase, you're going to be the owner and you're going to occupy it. Make sure you have your budget in place and you're ready to be well documented in terms of what you have to produce in order to get vetted through this process. It's going to take just as much going through private money as it would through a bank. But the only the positive going private money is that the credit criteria may be slightly looser than it would be from a bank.
We can be a little bit more creative in how we look at income.
Correct.
Like time and income, and in the ways that we document, income can be a little bit more creative.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
yeah. Okay. Well, we appreciate having you. I appreciate you having you on today, Jim. I appreciate you as a business partner. I appreciate doing business with you each and every day. And so thank you for coming on our podcast. And if somebody out there feels that this information is helpful to them, they can subscribe to the podcast to learn more.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on Real Loan Talk, hosted by Sonya Morgan. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and found the information valuable. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. For more detailed resources, visit our website at sjmorganple.com. You can also follow us on social media and explore our podcast website at realloantalk.com. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and let's achieve your financial dreams together.